Welcome, everybody. My name's Geraldine Cahill, and I am the Manager of Programs and Partnerships at Social Innovation Generation, or SIG, as it's commonly known. It is my pleasure to introduce you to this MaRS Global Leadership event, held in partnership with the SIG Inspiring Action for Social Impact series. We're especially pleased to welcome City Councillor John Fillion to MaRS for this presentation. Together with MaRS, SIG has been presenting this series since 2011, and we've been honoured to hear from people as far afield as from Denmark, Italy, Australia, the United Kingdom. But this year we decided to focus entirely on celebrating our own homegrown talent. In doing so, we recognise that during our last 8 years of existence, Canada has truly moved from a place of learning in social innovation to a place of leadership in a global community. Tonight, for our final Inspiring Action for Social Impact event of 2015, we present Tim Jones, who quite possibly holds one of my most aspirational positions, bridging, supporting, and championing the work of city builders and artists. Tim is the CEO of Artscape, which under his direction has grown from a provider of artist studios in Toronto to an internationally recognised leader in creative placemaking, leveraging the power of arts and culture to act as a catalyst of change, growth, and transformation of place. Tim coined this term in 2006, and today city builders around the world employ creative placemaking strategies to make cities more vibrant, prosperous, sustainable, and livable. After acting as mentor and coach to organisations and governments in Canada and abroad for many years, Tim now plays an active development role in markets outside Toronto. Tim has received many awards for his pioneering work, and in 2014, he was recognised by the Geneva-based Schwab Foundation as Social Entrepreneur of the Year. Following Tim's presentation, he will be joined by Zara Ibrahim. Zara is a change-driven creative, deeply invested in mobilising design process to explore community engagement, institutional innovation, and participatory design. She spent the last decade as the principal of the design think tank Architects, one of the first design-based innovation studios in the country, leading innovation projects with some of Canada's largest charities and governing bodies. Just last month, she took on co-leadership of Dublin, Canada, the country's largest design-based innovation firm. She's taught at various academic and cultural institutions and is currently the board chair of my favourite homegrown social innovation, Jane's Walk, among her many board positions. She was recently nominated as one of CBC's 12 Young Leaders to Watch and included in Toronto Life's 2014 issue of the 50 most influential people in the city. Obviously, that discussion will be great, and you are all invited to participate in the Q&A portion. There'll be a couple of microphones for you to use. If you can't wait that long to participate, please tweet to your heart's content using the hashtags MarsGL and/or IASI15. Now it's time to hand over to our social innovator of the evening and special guest, Tim Jones. Please join me in welcoming him to MaRS as he presents Culture as Urban Acupuncture.
Once close to every chance, now an opportunity to enhance from the spectrum of hope and gains, experience, learn and innovate. Regent Park, a home to the arts, hidden in hearts and active in minds. Creative gifts manifest and you'll find open, and not just your eyes to depict the beauty in the park often sheltered in lies. looking to find a place to shelter artistic minds, to grasp the talent unheard, talent they've blurred, talent they've left behind, to replace with breaking news of breaking hearts and rap with caution. Take time and time and time again. If only they knew the park is filled with hearts that beat for each other. It's just been redefined, but as it redesigns, the beating will be clear and recombined. Emphatic, roaring, piece of heart, piece of mind, piece of heart, pieces intertwined. As it redesigns, it will show the bright colors splattered against brick walls, damp with tears, colors that come alive when light skies disappear. Then let the art touch your heart, heart. Children that sing louder than gunshots, sounds that ring louder than sirens, echoing through the park, through Somali tongues to Tungusic, into Regent Park School of Music, lifting parts of broken hearts out of fear. Voices that empower, that touch not the skin, but what lies in here. So hear, but not just with your ears, to listen to the stories of stories often left unclear. Open the doors to Regent Park's Film Festival. Lights, cameras, and reactions, golden sparks of interaction. Lights, cameras, and attractions from all parts of the city. All we asked for was your heart and not your pity. All we asked for was your heart and not your pity. Be the change in the center of a social innovation. Watch every office turn into a foundation of inspiration. Hot desks of motivation as they smoothen the globe. Watch the new world unfold from youth engagement to poverty. Watch veiled eyes unroll. And clear your mind before you enter native art performing arts. Let the soles of your feet feel our mother's breaths in the ground as friction makes a sound, resounding, nature's gifts abounding. Feel as they teach spiritual fundamentals, native arts main credentials. It's the earth we live on, so celebrating their culture should be essential. And dance into Koba's open doors, West African style. Let the beat of the drums harmonize with the beat of your soul and let it travel miles. And even if you're spiritually drained as you dance, just smile. Smile till you can forget sadness and laugh at anger. Until you can look into the eyes of anyone as a future brother and not a stranger. Invest in relationships, you don't need to be a banker. Send your salams to a Muslim, go play dice with a gangster. Redefine stereotypes and send that to the news anchor. Don't judge anyone, it's a small world and we're all neighbors. See everyone as one. Let that be our new culture, along with our own, and let us hone a new art of hearts that have grown. Once close to every chance, now an opportunity to enhance from a spectrum of open gates. Experience, learn, and innovate.
Thank you. That is Mustafa Ahmed, the amazing 19-year-old poet from Regent Park, and he is a cultural force. Now, many of you, some of you, know me. You know that I'm not a heart on your sleeve kind of guy, at least not in public. But I'm telling you, every time I watched it, I was sitting there in the audience, just feeling all kind of worked up. You know, it's really quite amazing. That the talent that he has. And I want to give a huge shout out to Thompson Egbo, who's at the back of the room over there, who's really whose foundation funded this film and who himself appears in the film and directed the film. So fantastic work, Thompson. Also a native of Regent Park. So amazing, amazing. Mustafa's poetry really gives us permission, gives his neighbors permission to feel proud of their neighborhood. It empowers young people to speak out and get involved. It challenges our misconceptions and the negative stereotypes that have been created over decades. And it creates a personal connection between us and the future of Regent Park. And it sheds a lot on what I want to talk to you about tonight, which is the power of culture in transforming communities. You know, Mustafa's message, I think, is great stuff, but perhaps because it's about the intangible that he's talking about, perhaps because it's one part of a larger story, I think it's easy for us to underappreciate the importance of it, the potency, really, of something like that as an agent of community transformation. The way that people feel about a place affects all kinds of things, from personal happiness and health and vibrancy to actually the value of real estate. Tonight, I'm going to talk to you about what we at Artscape have learned over the last 30 years about the impact of people like Mustafa on their communities. And over the next 30 minutes, I'm going to try to unpack three things. What do we know about the way that artistic communities evolved? Why and how do artists affect place? And how can we take advantage of this knowledge, both to empower artists, but also to grow the city? Now, I'm going to make the case that we've been kind of in a bit of a fog about all this stuff. You know, kind of viewing it as some kind of mysterious phenomenon that happens that's, driven by these nebulous factors. It's a somewhat organic process. Nobody really knows what the story is. And I'm going to ask you to think about the way that Toronto has changed around us. You know, not too long ago, this city had a very well-earned reputation as Hogtown. And, you know, in the last couple of years, there have been all kinds of, I think, 6 major awards and distinctions. We've been recognized as, these are global distinctions, as the place with the best quality of life, the most livable, the most resilient, the most youthful, I love this next one, the most intelligent. And we've accomplished all of this, unbelievably, while also being the most tax competitive. So how about that? And if that's not enough, last year Vogue magazine sort of called us out, called West Queen West out, really, as the second coolest neighborhood in the world. And how did that happen when just 20 years ago it was this kind of seedy, kind of rock bottom kind of place? So I know not all of you put a lot of stock in these kind of accolades, but it's hard not to acknowledge that there's something kind of interesting, something dynamic happening in this city. And I think, don't you think, we need a better answer than it just kind of happened? Isn't it time that we develop more sophisticated understanding about the dynamic of culture in communities? Just imagine we had a world where we really recognized the role that artists play in city building and empowered them in all kinds of ways to do a whole lot more of it. Imagine if we engaged culture as a form of urban acupuncture, embraced the idea that pinpricks of urbanism can create huge change, that there can be methods of healing in cities where by stimulating nerves and unblocking channels, releasing pressure, we're able to solve problems and also to transform challenged neighborhoods into vibrant and healthy ones. Imagine a world where enlightened self-interest compelled policymakers, developers, community activists, and artists to put culture really at the center of and at the heart of city building. So those of you who know me know that these aren't just some far-fetched fantasies that I've cooked up because the good folks at MaRS have given me a soapbox to stand on tonight. It's really, I think, unlike most other places, we've got the knowledge on how to do these things. We've tested the prototypes. So that puts us on the verge of, I think, what is a world-leading breakthrough that can bring cultural richness to every corner of this city while making us at the same time a more inclusive and prosperous place. So let's start by exploring what makes creative communities grow and evolve. What are the sparks really that give rise to them in the first place? And why is it that some of them tend to go kind of viral? You know, there's a tired old story about artists in urban development. It's told in Toronto over and over again. It's major cities all over the world. And it goes like this. You've all heard it before. Artists move into a neighborhood. They bring all kinds of energy and activity. And they really start to animate the community. Real estate prices go up. And because artists are more often renters rather than owners, they get priced out of the neighborhoods that they've helped to enliven. The phrase the Soho Effect was coined quite a while ago, probably a couple of decades ago, to describe this process. And I can tell you, because I've been paying attention to these things over the last 16 years at Artscape, journalists love this story because it's full of drama. Right? You've got the evil developers as the villains. You've got the artists as the hapless victims of their own success. And as some of you have heard me say before, I just can't stand this narrative. And I'm not suggesting that displacement of artists and other low-income people aren't really serious issues for creative communities and for the city as a whole. But I think, and I really believe this, that the term, the Soho Effect, has outlived its usefulness. There are really kind of many problems with it. It implicates artists as the agents of yuppification of neighborhoods. It perpetuates the notion that cultural transformation is this kind of mysterious phenomenon. It paralyzes the creative community and the policymakers into kind of throwing their arms and saying nothing can be done. And it demonizes growth and change. So I don't believe really any of these things are true. I believe artists are actually the antidote to the homogenization of place, which is a big issue. I believe that we have a body of knowledge and practice that really allows us to leverage the power of the arts to help artists, but also grow the city at the same time. And I know that there are downsides to urban revitalization, namely the displacement of artists and low-income people, but I believe that growth gives us an opportunity to counteract those negative consequences in others. So let's try to unpack a little bit what's really going on in neighborhoods that are said to be undergoing the Soho Effect. Let's look at, sort of have a deeper dive into West Queen West. You know, 20 years ago, walking down the street, you're likely to encounter all the vestiges of poverty and people in social distress. There's marginal retail, overabundance of used appliance stores, many of them out on the street where you kind of navigate around them. Ossington Avenue had Ossington Avenue, now the home of the hipster, had the highest retail vacancy in the entire city. It was a tough neighborhood, one where most people didn't see a lot of hope or promise for the future. And we've had an interesting perspective as kind of a front row seat as West Queen West has evolved over the last 20 years. As the owner-operator of the first legal artist live work project, first legal artist live work space in the city that was zoned that way at the corners of Queen and Crawford. And then later with the Parkdale Arts and Cultural Center that opened in 1998. I think Artscape Triangle Lofts opened in 2011 and Artscape Young Place in 2013. And there's a history here where artists began migrating along Queen Street West probably in the 70s. And by 1995, when we were opening Artscape West Queen West, there really wasn't a whole lot going on artistically west of Trinity Bellwoods Park. Our project predated and actually was a bit of a kick to the creation of the candy and chocolate factory lofts that were across the street. And together, these projects, I think, triggered what is now helped to trigger what is now a robust creative community in the area. After our sort of pinprick, there was Jamie Angel, who opened the first gallery in the neighborhood, and that would inspire at least 50 others to follow suit. Then there was the Gladstone Hotel, the Zeidlers sort of brought to life, and followed by Jeff Stober's Drake Hotel. The Theater Center put the area on the map for the theater community, and MoCA later would help bolster West Queen West as the epicenter of contemporary art in Toronto. By 2006, more than 15% of people living in West Queen West were employed in the creative and cultural sector, more than 3 times the average across the whole city. And when we get that long-form census back, I'll be able to update you on the most recent stats for. Now, there's a familiar, if not predictable pattern to the ways these catalytic projects have emerged. Artist housing in studios, galleries, hotels, cafes, and specialty retail. You could say that each of these things attracted the other, and that collectively they became a huge magnet for residential development. And so within 15 years, West Queen West had gone from a cultural backwater to really one of the most vibrant creative scenes anywhere. So a similar pattern has repeated itself many years before in Gerrard Village, then in Yorkville, in New York, London, Paris, cities around the world. So how can we understand what this so-called phenomenon? You know, economists, Alfred Marshall in 1890 began espousing a theory that industries clustering together in areas give them better connections with both suppliers and customers. 100 years later, Harvard professor and business guru Michael Porter popularized the concept of business clusters, which is now the foundation of modern economic development theory and practice. And put simply, Porter put forth the idea that business clusters increase productivity of companies within the cluster, they drive innovation, and they stimulate new businesses. So this concept is often most associated with places like Silicon Valley or even Hollywood, but clearly the same thing is going on some level in West Queen West. Other elements of theory, economics theory, also apply, like the network effect, where the value of the network becomes more powerful to the people in it as the network grows, and the bandwagon effect, where people and firms are drawn to an area because of and by virtue of the trendiness of it. So my point is that far from being kind of a mysterious phenomenon, what we've actually seen happening in West Queen West can at least partially be explained by widely embraced economic theory. But there is at least one thing that makes artistic clusters different from other types of industry clusters. And that is, people actually want to hang out there. Nobody's really clamoring to go down to the industrial park for a latte, if you know what I mean. So there's an important distinction between artistic clusters and others that are focusing on science, technology, industry, and other businesses. So why is this? Let's really try to understand how and why artists add value to communities. And so just so that we're clear, as I'm talking about artists, I'm really referring to the people who generate expressive value. Visual and media artists, designers of all types, craftspeople, performing artists, and writers. So I'm not talking about the broader group of people that sort of, in Richard Florida's creative class, that includes the doctors, the lawyers, and other professionals. Just the people who create and are responsible for generating, producing, and distributing original creative content. But I'm not saying that you're all not creative, or that all these other people aren't creative, or that we're not all special in our own way. Just that artists play a key role in defining place. And to understand how they do this, you need to know what motivates them. A passion to change the world. The search for truth, beauty, and other virtues. A determination to expose falsehoods that provoke and challenge. A desire to explore new ideas, life, humanity, nature, the universe, fantasy, and the future. Expressions of love, anger, fear, and other emotions. And a tendency to be generally disruptive and wear funny outfits that challenge our fashion sensibility. So there are, of course, many other things that motivate artists, but you get the picture, you get the idea that artists are predisposed to being change makers because many of the things that motivate them are about changing reality or our perception of reality. But it's not just what motivates artists. The practice of being an artist also has an impact on communities. Artists are natural network builders. Porter's idea of a network really doesn't do justice to what artists really create. These places aren't just networks or networks of networks. artists create a full-on artistic scene. So creative scenes emerge in creative communities, artistic communities. Really, it's amazing without anyone even having to go to a meeting about it. And they're essential for, I think, 3 important reasons. Firstly, the scene creates a platform for new ideas, for collaboration, innovation. It's difficult, if not impossible in today's world, to think about being an artist in an echo chamber. Originality, I think, is derived from reflecting on, parsing, rearranging, and juxtaposing ideas. And for most artists, this is a face-to-face kind of exercise, and they're drawn to places where there are dense concentrations of other artists because both the people and the place become a never-ending source for inspiration and provide lots of opportunities for co-creation, for reflection, and critique. Secondly, the scene is the artist's marketplace. Being relevant as an artist means actually connecting with an audience, a patron, a consumer, as well as with other artists. And this requires a really vast network sometimes of suppliers, collaborators, production facilities, agents, dealers, producers, distributors, retailers. And let's not forget that the creative and cultural sector in Toronto employs 5% of our total workforce and generates $11 billion in annual GDP. So this is not some small submarket that we're talking about. The scene is important to artists because it really affects their ability to make a living. With 4 to 7 times more likely as artists being self-employed than the average Canadian, many artists find themselves as the career self-employed, cobbling together an income based on various jobs, contracts, commissions, and sometimes in a variety of different disciplines. So an area that is with dense concentrations of creative people, where there are opportunities to plug into different types of freelance and other types of opportunities become very attractive to artists. Thirdly, I think this is important, that artists derive both their professional, a part of their professional and their social status from their role within the scene. So networking is an essential way for an artist to get noticed and to get their work noticed. I don't know if you have friends who are musicians and you ask them what are they doing this week. They're going to a jam session with other local musicians. They're performing at a benefit to raise money for a local charity. They're recording a track on a local buddy's, or one of their buddies' albums. They're attending the opening of a friend's visual art exhibition. They're teaching a class at a local school. They're being a mentor to a young up-and-coming musician. And so none of this necessarily pays the bills, but it's essential in building a profile and making sure that the community is going to be there for them when it's their moment on stage. So you can see that artists actually have so much riding on the success of their neighborhoods. And if you put that together, you put these things together, the passion that motivates them with their innate proclivity to be scene builders, you get this extraordinary, really extraordinary community development force. And there are a whole bunch of things that flow from that. They contribute to place distinctiveness by literally changing the look and feel of places through things like public art, through posters, graffiti, murals, street furniture, and window displays. They foster social cohesion and generate social capital by creating opportunities for interaction, reflection at performances, exhibition events, and other gatherings. And they alter our experience of place, how we think and feel about it, and the story that becomes part of our collective consciousness. So while on their own, just like Mustafa in his poem, these contributions may be from artists in West Queen West may seem to be of limited consequences. They've actually created an identity for this place that's attracted attention around the world. And in today's mass-marketed world where everything kind of starts to look, every neighborhood starts to look like the other, every city begins to look like the other, when you can walk down the Champs-Élysées in Paris and you're confronted with the Gap and H&M and the same kind of stores that you see everywhere else, you can't really fault the hipster or anyone else for that matter being attracted to a place like West Queen West that gives us a more authentic character. The things that motivate artists to make them natural change makers, and the practice of being an artist compels them to connect and leave their imprint really on our communities. So it stands to reason then that when a critical mass of people come together in a neighborhood, it's not just other creatives that are interested. Everyone, it seems, is drawn to this, and that makes a really strong, powerful push for residential development. So some of you are thinking, well, what about gentrification? You know, attractiveness and growth are good problems to have. If we understand how culture creates value in urban development, if we know that that value that's going to be generated is predictable, we can leverage it to accommodate artists, to provide space for low-income people, and accommodate urban growth at the same time. And actually, we don't have to look any further than West Queen West, the Queen West Triangle, for examples of how this can happen. Projects like Artscape Triangle Lofts, Artscape Young Place, the Theater Center, a new sculpture-filled park, and other projects represent the first time that I'm aware of where we've got an arts building boom happening alongside and supported by a condo building bonanza, and that included 250 units of new affordable housing. So this is a place where Artscape has worked with others, the city, a group called Active 18, developers and community members, really to develop prototypes in what some are now calling creative placekeeping. And we did this by taking advantage of a little extra density to allow all of these other people to remain in the community, the artists and others. Celebrated urbanist Jaime Lerner, mayor of Curitiba in Brazil in the 70s and 80s, introduced this concept of urban acupuncture. The idea that urban innovation is often driven by small-scale projects and individuals within communities. I was really introduced to this idea by Margie Zeidler, who is a bit of an instigator, I think, in helping get Jaime's book translated into English. And so I discovered this a few years ago, thanks to her pushing him to write that, to translate the book into English. And so Jaime's notion is that small-scale innovation can have a large impact, that there are a growing number of people, of urban innovators, engaged in a practice that seeks to intentionally provoke change, that like acupuncture, that there is a deep body of knowledge behind it and an art to practicing it. These ideas really resonated very strongly for me and my colleagues at Artscape because they reinforced actually some of our own experience around culture as a catalyst for change. We started really to think differently about creativity and culture around the millennium when, as you recall, all kinds of new books were being written, Florida Landry, a guy named John Hawkins, about the relationship between creativity, the economy, and cities. The opportunity to become an anchor tenant and development partner in the distillery district really gave us an opportunity to test some of this thinking, how culture and development could work together to transform a place. You know, I got a phone call in December 2001 from John Berman, a guy who just one of a partnership who just bought the distillery district. And 15 months later, we opened 63 artist studios in the distillery district. It was a kind of crazy affair. And a few months later, there was an opening party and 70,000 people showed up. Culture had dramatically accelerated the planning, the design, the construction, the tenanting process, attracted enormous interest and investment in and around this project. And that is, for me, when the penny actually dropped. We'd been thinking about creative space as a need that somebody had to take responsibility for, rather than a resource and an opportunity for investment. There were lessons in the distillery about the catalytic role of microclusters of creative people and the role that they could play in kickstarting this revitalization process. And so by 2006, we'd coined the term creative placemaking, by which we meant not just placemaking in a creative way, but leveraging the power of culture to promote the change, growth, and transformation of place. Projects like Daniel Spectrum in Regent Park, where we met Mustafa and Thompson and many other amazing people, really helped to evolve our thinking and practice even further. We learned there, and should acknowledge Derek Valentine, who was visionary leader of Toronto Community Housing, that helped kickstart that whole innovative partnership that's making Regent Park possible. We learned there that it was possible to break out of the usual roles that pitted the developer, the housing agency, the community activist, the municipality, and artist against each other. We learned how to find common purpose among us, how to build value together. And we've demonstrated, I think, that when you're able to do this, you can not only kind of build all kinds of social capital and social infrastructure and a wide range of different programs. You can do this because, in part, because together we're creating a multi-billion-dollar market for residential development. So what does all this mean for the future? I've thought about 4 areas that we can work on that I think could be game-changing, not just for Artscape and others who want to get involved in this work, but I think for the city as a whole. We've been applying some of the lessons that we've learned about creative placemaking, and we have 2 major new projects that we're very excited about in the Central Waterfront, Artscape Launchpad, a new center for creative sector entrepreneurship, and Artscape Triangle Lofts, a new 80-unit artist live-work project. And we're thrilled to be playing a role in what some people believe is one of the most important redevelopments in our city in decades. But imagine if we had the public policy and incentives to ensure that creativity was baked into every new major area redevelopment. What if we took the phenomenal lessons from Regent Park and applied them to other Toronto community housing revitalizations, other employment land conversions? What if we really truly incentivized the public-private nonprofit partnerships that delivered shared value? Secondly, let's anticipate and take measures to counteract the displacement of artists and other low-income people from creative communities. We know it's going to happen. We've got the models. We've demonstrated what we can do. I'm not saying it was pretty, because it was messy in the Queen West Triangle, but it can be done. What if we, as part of our planning process, deliberately created creative place-keeping strategies in places like the Junction, West Queen West, and others? What if we put in place public policy that allowed for inclusionary zoning to make sure that creative low-income people continue to be part of these neighborhoods? What if we treated galleries like the way we treat theaters? That's not such a crazy idea, is it? And it exempted them from property taxes. What if we reverted to the pre-2000 practice of taxing nonprofit organizations at the residential rate? That would in itself be a huge help in helping in creative place keeping. Thirdly, Toronto's becoming increasingly a divided city. There's a growing gap not only between the rich and the poor, but a growing sense of unease between the downtown and the suburbs. We've heard a little bit about this in the last couple of elections municipally. Next week, City Council is poised to sign off on our first major project. We're so proud of this, called Artscape Weston Hub. It's another highly innovative deal involving the city, the Rockport Group, a private developer, Artscape, and a whole bunch of community partners. Imagine if we replicated this Weston model in a dozen neighborhoods across the city to catalyze the reimagination of our suburbs and begin to knit the city back together through culture. Imagine if the Mustafas of Melbourne, of Lawrence Heights, of Jane and Finch, and Thorncliffe Park had platforms to support their creative expression. Imagine if, and this one is really an exciting one because I think it's going to happen, the province comes through with all of the recommendations that the Premier has just endorsed around community hubs. And our new federal government has committed to spend 1/3 of the billions that they're going to invest in infrastructure and social infrastructure. Imagine if that happens, what we can do in the next 4 years. We may be living in the most livable city in the world, but you don't actually have to look very far to find urban blight. And when you start looking for it, you actually see it is everywhere. You know, when Jaime Lerner was confronted with the challenge of his city, actually absolutely littered with garbage without the resources to pick it up. For decades, this filth had really made the city feel like an unloved and undesirable until the new mayor came up with a plan, an idea to pay citizens to pick up garbage. And guess what? In a heartbeat, that city was cleaned from top to bottom. It put some hard-earned cash and it landed in people's pockets who really needed it, and businesses began to flourish. So what if we look for opportunities to take a page out of Jaime Lerner's book and enlisted artists to tackle urban blight? What if we got inspired by what they'd done in Melbourne in activating their laneways and really got behind that kind of thing? You know that typically artists in Toronto earn less than half of their income from their creative practice. So there's a lot of unused talent that we could put to work in all kinds of great ways. And I think tackling urban blight would be one fantastic way. So just to wrap all of this up, I suggest to you that while we've accomplished a lot in our city, there's so much more that we can and should do. We have a phenomenal resource in the artists of this city, but neither they nor our neighborhoods really have reached their potential. We know how and why artists bring life to neighborhood, and we've demonstrated over and over again that how culture as kind of a form of urban acupuncture can trigger both the transformation of people and places. We need to approach this city building effort not from the perspective of whose need is most important or how much it's going to cost, but by thinking about how do we really build value together. I think, as you might have gathered by now, I'm a bit of an optimist. But I really believe we can do all these things. Through concerted creative placekeeping efforts, we can put the Soho Effect in the rearview mirror. And I believe that we're truly in an enviable position to lead the world in developing vibrant and inclusive communities. I think this is a really exciting time to be in this city, and I really look forward to working with all of you to help make some of these dreams become reality. Thank you very much.
So I have the enviable role of getting to pick your brain about all those things, and you really set us up. I have about 20 questions that just came out of your talk just now, and I guess where you ended was really interesting for me, and maybe it's just too Canadian of a question to ask, but you talk about like it's so exciting to be in the city right now, and we were just together at a conference in New York in the spring, and I started to hear about things like Artscape happening all over America. And so I'm curious to maybe we could start off with how are we uniquely positioned in Toronto or even in Canada to lead the world? You talked a lot about that, about how we can sort of set a bar. What can we do here? What's the opportunity here that's different than elsewhere?
Last week I was speaking at a conference in London called the World Cities Cultural Forum. And it was it's a annual gathering of the directors of culture from 30 of the biggest cities in the world. And it struck me, I was really struck there that on almost every panel discussion, every plenary session, the challenge that directors of culture are facing in municipalities, it all came back to real estate.
Right.
The challenge of artists being priced out is the biggest issue that people are dealing with. Many other cities in the world are working on the get a grant, deliver a program approach, where the expectation is that artists are entitled to space and that governments have to foot the bill. There is no way in the world, given the scope and the urgency of the challenge, that we're going to actually solve that problem through that approach. Right. And so what we're finding is when at this conference and elsewhere, that people are turning to us because we've actually figured out how to work with the developers, with the community, with the city, all at the same time. So, and I think that's kind of a Canadian. I talk to Joe Barrage about this all the time. I think that there is kind of something Canadian in that we're good collaborators. We actually know how to, and we can approach this conversation about not just what do we need to get from the developer, but what can we bring to the table, and how can we make it work for everybody.
Right, and there's that sort of, that reciprocity is something that, we talked about. We had a brief chat yesterday, and one of the things that that was really interesting to me about what you're doing is that, you talked about artists being priced out, and the greatest part about Artscape is that they get to stay in the community. Now, one of the things about having some of the spaces that you have is that they actually have walls, and the artists are contained within those walls. And so what does it look like when the artists can be when the walls become a porous membrane? Like, what does that actually look like? How, one of my questions that came up when you were describing who's an artist and who's not, and I had my own identity crisis as you described that, let's just say for now that I'm a non-artist. What do you want my experience to be? How do I permeate that, membrane, or how do you want me to experience it in the neighborhood?
Well, many of our projects, particularly our community hub projects, our community cultural hub projects, are really not meant to be just for artists, but we're working at the intersection of arts and culture, urban development, community activism, philanthropy, and public policy. So it's kind of this strange kind of melange of different people, policies, and issues. And the challenge is, how do you build a shared vision that is going to unite people, and how do you create space for people to interact in? So in the early days of Artscape, we created these artist studio buildings that didn't have a lot of life in them. People were kind of working behind their closed doors, and there's a value to that for artists, but they weren't really dynamic places. I think Jane Jacobs really, again, Margie Zeidler is another instigator here, introduced me to Jane, who really inspired us to think differently about how to kind of connect artists to community, and how to use space as a platform to do that.
And so what have been the most successful integration models in all of your buildings and properties across the area and across the region? Where has that worked really well? Like, how does that show up on the day-to-day basis? What does that look like?
Are you asking me to pick a favorite child?
A little bit.
They're quite different, each project. Our approach is to build the vision from the ground up in the community. So what we do in Witchwood or Toronto Islands is going to be very different than what happened in Regent Park or in Parkdale. So, I think each of them have fantastic, amazing things happening, but in different ways, and that speak to the needs and also the dreams and aspirations of those communities. So and we're actually, honestly, the real estate's just a canvas that people then kind of fill in, and so it's really the most exciting things, I think, happen sort of when artists are mixing and mingling with other people. Like the interplay between the urban agriculture and farmers market and the artists and the environmentalists up at the barns, I think, is pretty special. Or equally, the Center for Social Innovation in Regent Park and how that plays, not just with the people in the building, but with the whole neighborhood and that end of the city. So, it's the energy that the places the connections that happen are the most exciting parts.
So, we talk a lot about, the community being really integrated with the artists who are, in the container that you're creating, which is so amazing. And yesterday when we had a conversation, I said, not unlike Geraldine, I'm like, you got a great gig. What's hard about your job? And I'm sure there are lots of things. But one of the things you said was, sometimes you hear from artists, well, I thought it was all about me. And sometimes they want more from you. And so we're so positioned to say, how can the community come in and share your space? And you just talked about, sometimes artists need that distinct space. So what are you finding about surprising artists' needs? Because they might not always need to be interfacing with the community. And what did you mean by that statement?
My colleague Celia Smith, who's here somewhere, often says at the back here, we make things look too easy. Because actually each one of our projects, when they happen, is a minor bloody miracle. Really, the mountains that have to move in order to make these things happen, it's almost impossible. And the high wire financing acts, the kind of the crazy timelines, the impossible budgets, the kind of planning to navigating through 15 departments of the city. I mean, it's just on and on and on. They're really tricky things to pull together. But back to your question. I think that one of the challenges that we have is that we are kind of, in many ways, an intermediary. So we're actually trying to build bridges between constituencies that don't always see a partner on the other side of the table. And so different constituencies come to us with different expectations. And sometimes it's the artists who say, well, we thought this project's all about us.
Right.
And it is, but it's also about the other stakeholders who've been part of making it happen. And so that's kind of always an interesting conversation to have,
right.
and an interesting role to play, to be kind of trying to build those bridges between different stakeholders who may not sort of see the value of the other partners that are required to make something happen,
Right.
including the local community, which is always a big part of it.
And that bridge, in multiple dimensions, can be hard to build. Specifically, when I'm sure this is another narrative you absolutely hate, but is Artscape in bed with developers? And what does that actually mean? Like, how do you negotiate that when you have artists who are being priced out, but the developers who are trying to work with you to keep them in the neighborhood while also driving their bottom line? What's your relationship to that narrative? Because I imagine it's something that comes up.
Well, I was very inspired when I first started Artscape many years ago. I was really struggling with this challenge, and I realized that the number of people who cared about creative space issues, even though it could be the most pressing challenge in the world, the number of people who cared about this issue were way too small to solve the problem, and the numbers, the amount of money that was required to address it, bigger than Arts Council budgets combined at all levels, kind of thing. So it's a kind of big thing. And I was really inspired by the chair of the Waterfront Revitalization Task Force. I'm just drawing a blank on his name right now, but it will come to me in a minute. Somebody can shout it out. Sorry? Robert Fung, right. And he'd had this challenge of the waterfront. We've been talking about it for decades, and the problem was framed. Who's going to take responsibility for this toxic waste dump on our water's edge? And you can't scatter bureaucrats and others from a room more quickly by posing the problem in that way. But what he managed to do was to reframe the whole challenge as an opportunity for investment. Right. And I thought, that's exactly what we need to do at Artscape. Because if I get a group of artists together at a table and ask them where to invest $1 million, real estate's probably the last place people will think it, even though it's a pressing need. So that really helped us kind of think differently and say, okay, rather than going to a developer and say, with a cap in hand and saying, I need your support to do what I want to do, we kind of learned how to say, what value do we bring to the table, and how can we leverage this for the artist, but how can we help you too? And when we started having those kind of conversations, we found that there were a whole lot of people who were interested in having that conversation, and things really started to take off. So that was inspiration from the waterfront.
Yeah, for sure. One of the things, going back to how all of us envy your job, one of the things that I've been thinking about, and we talked very briefly about, is that part of what you're trying to create, and you spoke to it in your talk, was a platform, not a project, or a platform, not projects. And one of the things that I want to know is, like, how does this go from being Artscape driven to more integrated? And you touched a little bit on the possibilities of policy incentives, and getting artists more enabled to deal and attack the urban blight. But how does this become less org-led and more integrated as a platform in the city, in the way that we work, in the way that we build community? Long after this generation of city builders has passed, like, how do we integrate the work of Artscape more into some of the work that lots of other people in this room do?
Right. Well, I think there are two things. First, I think when you create physical platforms, they actually have a life, and they can be passed on from generation to generation, and so they can be invented and reinvented, and they should be invented and reinvented. And we've seen that in the arts communities, where theaters, where anything that's venue-based has had a life beyond the originators, typically, if the asset is secured. The other thing is, we really need an enabling framework to make it a whole lot easier to do this work. And the community hub strategy from the province is kind of moving in that direction. But, as things stand now, there are only a handful of, what might be called space-making intermediaries. There's Artscape, there's Evergreen, there's United Way with their community hubs, there's Center for Social Innovation. So there are only a handful of us who've got this sophisticated knowledge on how to do complicated real estate sort of deals and kind of see these kind of crazy projects through to fruition.
Right.
But if there was a better enabling framework, I think others, sort of smaller scale projects could also make a whole lot of sense. And that's really what needs to happen, because the ecology can't be made up of just artscapes and CSIs and et cetera. There needs to be lots of different people and players kind of doing this kind of work.
So what is, I mean, I'm curious, and this might be another conversation, I'm curious as to, how, what switched or what pushed on the lever for you to make this decision? Like, what was that real moment of urgency? Because I think when you're starting a social innovation, or you take city building as a hobby and turn it into a profession in this sort of moment of urgency. Like, I think we all have seen that, where we've started an organization or taken on a new role or whatever, because we see that this is the moment to do it. What was that moment for you? Like, what was that origin moment that inspired you to take on this complex, crazy, ambitious challenge?
I don't know if there's a moment in time, but I know that when people first started calling me a social entrepreneur, I had to look it up. I didn't really know what it meant. And that was kind of, it actually became a really empowering thing for me personally. Right. Because I'd kind of spent my entire work life in the nonprofit sector, and nobody was talking about entrepreneurship. And it was actually incredibly liberating that I could think in a way that was differently about how do I chase the foundation or the government for grants, that we, to think about social enterprise, about creating value and those kinds of things. And that's been, I think, hugely liberating for me personally. Right. And then to kind of connect with a whole field of other social entrepreneurs who are cooking up crazy stuff. I think that's been the most, I think one of the most important things in my career path.
Right. So as you think about your career path, and you have I think you said it like 3 times in your talk. You were like, this is the project I'm most excited about, and there were a couple of them that you referred to, and that's a really great position to be in. But what's the thing you haven't been able to do? Because I think a lot of the people in this room, I'm going to speak on behalf of all the people here, that I think everyone wants to help advocate for this mission, help build on what you're doing, and build the momentum. And so, what haven't you been able to do? And I know you spoke to the 4 areas for the future to plug into, but specifically around the real estate and how those projects have unfolded. What's the thing that you still scratch your head about around how you do these projects, and maybe how folks in this room could participate?
Well, I think the project that we're spending a lot of time on right now is called Artscape Launchpad, and this is a very new direction for us, and I think could actually be a big breakthrough, and the one project typology that actually we scale up nationally or internationally. And it really kind of has been born out of years of research that we've done, and our interest in what are the conditions that will help creative people thrive. And early research, I'm literally talking about 10 years ago, kind of started pointed us down this path, where we kind of learned about the challenges around artists making a living and the uneven access to the development of business acumen as artists. So, we learned things that, there's a mismatch between education and incomes in our sector, that artists leaving school lose access to all the equipment and technology, that they require to actually practice their work, right? And that there's kind of a challenge around kind of more of a mindset issue, where people think business is something, just kind of like me, around entrepreneurship. They don't actually understand how they can unlock and give them the freedom to do what they want to do. So this project is a really kind of interesting thing. It's a creative co-working space. People pay a monthly membership. They'll get access to all this equipment and technology. But there's also kind of a really robust entrepreneurship development program that we're building. We'll deliver part of it, colleges and universities, trade and service organizations. So it's an exciting project. It's part of the City of the Arts project in the Central Waterfront. And we think, in terms of game changers, that this one could be a real phenomenal thing, to help empower artists, help them raise their incomes and kind of pursue their dreams in a more fulfilled way.
Right. And so when you look at your projects, and it's been interesting to be around the projects, I think all of us have interfaced with Artscape in really different ways. And, what does right now you have this really interesting model where people are starting to understand what it means in their neighborhood. I live right beside Artscape Young Place, and it's our community living room now. And we now, have extended the amount of public space in our minds that we have, which is really cool. And so, sometimes this change happens dramatically where that acupunctural flow that you spoke to happens overnight, and all of a sudden this place becomes vibrant. But in other circumstances, these become places that people know are artist communities, and they start to, permeate the wall. And they start to use it as, a coffee shop, which is, how a lot of folks in my community use it. We use it as, on a cold day, a lot of people come into the lobby and do stuff for a few minutes, and because we know we have permission to use that building. But what is the next phase, the next natural phase from the resident in the community who feels like they can walk through the doors, they can sit down and have a coffee, they can, hang out with their kids for a few minutes. What's the next level of engagement, even if it's incremental, that, I think of someone like myself or a lot of people who probably live or engage with Artscape buildings. What's that next level of engagement that's not consuming the artwork necessarily every day, but what does that look like?
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, well, we've got to consult you on that.
Yeah.
Sounds like you have some good ideas. Yeah. That's a good question. And I think that's just part of the path that all of our projects are on. It's a process of discovery, and each new project kind of breaks through a different wall in a different way. And sometimes, the amazing women who run our community cultural hubs, we call them at Artscape our hubbies, and they get together and they're kind of like it's a hive of energy and activity and sharing things that have worked in one place and taking it to another place. So I don't know how to answer that question. What's the next innovation that's going to come out in these things? But we're always looking for new ones. And maybe it'll happen in Weston. Maybe there's 8,000 square feet of non-residential space in that project, and 26 artist live work units, a big outdoor programming area. And we're now in a community design process to kind of understand, well, what does that space going to, how is it going to be configured for the best use for that community?
Right.
Which is probably very different than certainly in Regent Park or Artscape Young Place, which are very different communities.
Right. It's funny, I don't know where this question's going to go, but I'm going to start it anyways, which is, I think part of why, and this might be just a platitude or a cliche, but part of what the challenges with people interfacing with art is sometimes it's hard to understand, right? And it makes us feel illiterate. And so because we feel illiterate, we shut down, and then we don't, look back up again because we had that moment or that accumulation of moments where we felt like we couldn't possibly understand, or how do we start to use spaces like this to make people more literate on art? And it might not be engaging with the artists themselves, but what are those opportunities to build literacy around how to derive meaning from art? Because I think that's part of what you're doing as well.
Yeah, and I think we can't just build places and assume that people are going to walk in the door.
Yes.
In Regent Park, as we're scheming on Regent Park with a community steering committee, we realized that many of us didn't have the language skills even to connect with the community. 47 different languages spoken in Regent Park. 56 different countries of origin.
Right.
So we now have staff who kind of go out and spend a lot of time out of the building, kind of trying to entice people in, connect with kids to bring their parents and that kind of thing. So it's about finding, you can't just assume that you can build it and people are going to stream in. I'm looking at Seema, who's responsible for this activity in Regent Park. There's a huge effort to actually reach out in a meaningful way and engage people so that it becomes part of their experience. And that's part of, one of the things I'll never forget is a community meeting we had. And somebody said, in their days when we were kind of, before we had any money it was actually when we had some money and we were consulting the community about some of the programming. And she said, well, how do we know that you're not going to build this big, shiny building? And we, the poor people of Regent Park, are going to be on the outside looking in. And it was just a moment of horror that kind of flashed, I think through all of our minds, because we thought, that is exactly what would be a disaster. That
Right.
you just defined what disaster looks like
Right.
for us. So how do we need to, how can we build access and affordability into this thing, into this project for the community? How do we create free access for people, but then also how do we outreach to the community so that they really feel that it's theirs?
And I'm going to ask one more question because I want to hog you for one more minute before I open it up. So start thinking about your questions. I guess just on that note, you've done such a good job in places like Regent Park in building trust and building ownership from the community. The community feels like Walter Gropius, I think, used to say people vote with their feet. And every time I've been in that building, people are using it. And so what was that lever? What was that switch that made people go from the question they were asking you to really trusting you as an ally and a partner who could represent their needs, wants, wishes, and needs?
Well, I think it's partly the School of Hard Knocks. I mean, I don't know if anyone remembers the Witchwood Barns project and the incredible controversy that happened around that project. A few missteps on the community consultation front.
Right.
So you learn from those things and you improve in the future projects. And so with each new project now, we're very deliberate about how we reach out and engage the community.
Right.
We've developed a kind of methodology for customizing a governance and community stewardship plan for that project so that people have a voice in the way that they're operated. If you kind of look at our annual report, you'll see like cajillion committees that people are on that are kind of adding, to the programming, to the, to the governance, to the garden committee, to the whatever, right? Like there's a lot of different ways, and but and you have to continue to do that because you might do that this year, but 2 or 3 years down the road, the people who were at the table, have left or they're involved somewhere else, and so you've got to continually do that. So it's a constant effort to keep that healthy kind of governance and community stewardship alive.
Yeah, you've clearly done a great job because there are so many community members who really, in quite obvious ways take stewardship of your spaces. So it's you're to be commended on that. So I'm going to start sharing and open up the floor. I believe there are 2 mics. There's a mic there and a mic over there. If we have any questions, we have a few minutes to take a couple questions. And a few minutes to think of your questions as well.
I'm ready to speak.
Okay, great.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I really appreciated your talk and exciting successes and projects to come on the urban cultural landscape. Unfortunately, I have a little bit of a disconnect. I'm a cultural entrepreneur and rural acupuncturist. I'm from Northern Ontario, a small town of 1,100 people called Cobalt, and I've been involved in quite a few activities up there and helping to kickstart things. And I'm just wondering if you have any specific leadership resources from Artscape to help rural communities blossom their cultural gardens.
Yes, actually. We have a department at Artscape called our Creative Placemaking Lab. It's run by Prue Roby, who's a vice president over here with the...
And I'm sitting right beside her.
You're sitting beside her.
And she's given me your business card, so I'm definitely going to have to follow that up. Yeah, I think it was not coincidental that I sat beside her.
Yeah, so their role for the rest of the folks here is to build and share knowledge with communities across Canada, around the world. We have a lot of huge... one of the things we did years ago was invested in putting a lot of our intellectual property online. So we've got a huge Artscape DIY site that's available free to people. We do webinars. We teach a university course in creative placemaking through UBC. So we've got a lot of stuff going on that front. I would say for people in rural communities that this clustering concept is equally important because people become invisible in the landscape. But it looks differently. Prince Edward County sort of is probably the best example of a creative rural economy strategy, where they put together the winemakers, the cheesemaker, the art trails, and actually made it the cornerstone of their economic development strategy. And just bringing the people together, and developing those things, it's where the Prince Edward County, the county brand came out of that whole initiative. And it's been incredibly powerful if you look at the change. Like, most people I know, sort of in Toronto, had no clue about what was Prince Edward County 10 years ago. Today, it's like on everybody's radar, and a lot of people are flocking out there. So I think that there are other examples as well. So I think talk to Prue, and she can point you to some of those.
Great, thank you very much.
Awesome. You have another question?
Yes, my name is Richard Joy with the Urban Land Institute. The series is titled Global Leadership, and I know that Artscape has become, over the years, one of Toronto's greatest global exports of ideas and thinking. Your model has captured the imagination of much of the world. I want to know if you could speak a little bit to your export in terms of how the rest of the world is receiving Artscape.
Well, for years, we had the philosophy that it's better to teach other people to fish rather than to go into other markets and do the fishing for them. But we actually, last year, broke our own rule by creating BC Artscape in Vancouver. After realizing that, after 6 or 7 years of trying to build the capacity of other people to do these complicated real estate development deals, that our brand was now at a point where just the value of lending that to an initiative or to creating an organization in BC, as we've done, would accelerate things dramatically. So we are starting to look at, how we can help in other markets. We're having interesting conversations in places both in Canada and elsewhere. We haven't quite figured it out, but the Vancouver project called BC Artscape is giving us the kind of helping us think through kind of what is really almost like a social franchise sort of experiment. And we're putting all the agreements in place, the board in place, all of that kind of stuff, and that's going to, I think, allow us to figure out how we scale up in the future. There are people at Artscape who've developed these crazy Artscape universe charts, and so we're starting to think about that, but we're starting with the first step out in Vancouver. Thanks for the question.
Awesome. Right.
Thanks for sharing your story, Tim. I'd love to go deeper around where the ecology goes, to use your language, which I think is totally appropriate. So you have this permeable membrane, you have artists who are in a nice container, you have publics who are able to come in and interface with their process. What is the appropriate legal framework with the developers or the appropriate policy legislation that allows for security for the surrounding artist communities? What needs to be established for the ecosystem to grow and to be a healthy, vibrant place?
Well, I think as communities grow and change, and where there's intensification of development, which is happening all over the downtown of Toronto, that there's an opportunity through things like inclusionary zoning, and which could involve artist projects or not, to actually create a whole lot more affordable housing than we're currently doing. I heard a statistic that was staggering recently that in Section 37 contributions, which is a way that the city levers community benefits contributions out of developers in exchange for extra density, that Toronto, on average, kind of pulls about 20% of the land value out of those deals, whereas Vancouver is taking 80%. And so if you look at the amount of affordable housing and other initiatives that are going, the way that they're using density to pay for the communities that they want to live in, it's quite extraordinary. So I think that we can do that here in Toronto. And cities, I was just in London, and people were really kind of challenged with this idea. How do I like just put another floor in everything? Everything's so short over there that there's lots of opportunities for a little bit of extra density that's not going to kill everything, that can actually support the kinds of things that communities need to keep in place as they grow and evolve. So we need, as I said earlier, we need in areas like the Junction, West Queen West, we need deliberate creative place-keeping strategies. You can't do this work in a crisis. You can't do this when the building's being, people are getting evicted, and you can't step in a week and kind of solve a problem like that. You need to be working years in advance to anticipate it, to put the things in place and be ready so that as the development applications are coming in, you're actually having that conversation with the developers and figuring out how to make it all work. So there are some basic public policy tools, and inclusionary zoning, I think, is a really important one for us.
Another question, and then over there.
Tim, it's an absolutely visionary program, this, and a great talk. As somebody who's just moved to Toronto 4 months ago, it's the specificity to Toronto that fascinates me about this. I mean, you talk about this program all over the world. It's widely imitated in other parts of the world, but how much of the way it's grown up do you think is specific to Toronto? If you'd been developing this program somewhere else, do you think it would have grown up very differently? I mean, do you think how specific is it to this place?
Well, you know, when we travel to other places, people always say, oh, well, that's okay, that's great for Toronto, but that would never work here, you know? And I never accept that, you know, because many of the concepts that we're working with, the idea of clustering people, the idea of using density in order to pay for things, these are things that happen in many other cities, so I think that they're absolutely transferable. I think it's absolutely true, however, that there is a lot of local context, that there are different things. Just, you know, for example, last week, because it's on my mind, I was in London, and, you know, the idea of adding density is kind of like it's like a sacred cow over there. So you can suggest that, but that's a really hard nut to crack. So you have to look at other different ways to approach the problem. So, you know, there's no hard and fast rule here. It's really just about being innovative, understanding some of the basic principles, and then seeing how you can apply them in different contexts to achieve somewhat similar results.
Welcome to Toronto. I can't see you now, but welcome. Okay.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Dudek. I am an independent contractor in the cultural fields. And I just wanted to speak to you a little bit about, you mentioned Artscape as a buzzing hive of women. And this is something that I've noticed myself, having just graduated from the University of Toronto a couple of years ago. A lot of my peers were women. I worked in the volunteer department at the City of Toronto for Nuit Blanche this year. 72% of our volunteers were women. Over at Humber College, I was there speaking to the arts administrative students there, also women. So my question to you is kind of, what do you think the barriers are for men getting involved in the arts? And maybe as in talking about Artscape Launchpad and kind of what ideas you have and kind of opening the doors to men in arts.
That's a great question.
I've never been asked that question. I really actually want to turn it over to Celia Smith to answer that question. I think that's a really interesting point that you raised, and I haven't really given it a lot of thought. I think it's true. I think the majority of people who work at Artscape are women, and that's a great thing. So I haven't thought about how we can encourage more men in the field. It's generally not been a problem in other areas, as you know. So.
Thank you.
Awesome. And this will be our last question.
Hi, Tim. I was wondering if you'd be able to speak to whether or not Artscape views there being certain key characteristics to encourage physical spaces to allow for collaboration across diversity or with diverse groups of people.
Well, yes. I mean, I think it was probably 5 or 6 years ago when we kind of realized that our projects all had to, you know, particularly the community cultural hubs, but all of them for that matter, really what we were creating were platforms for collaboration. So you have to think differently about how you can design for that, for emergence, for people to bump into each other. There needs to be social space. You know, some of the early projects that had none of that are not the most interesting and dynamic places. So you actually have to build those things in. But it's not enough just to design the space. You actually have to work really hard at building a community and creating a culture that allows for and encourages collaboration within the building. You know, we used to think in the early days, you just throw a bunch of artists together and all magical things would happen. And guess what? They didn't necessarily. And people sometimes fight with each other and with us. And, you know, so it actually takes a lot of effort to build a community within a building and equally to connect that building and that energy to the surrounding community. So we have people who you know, whose job it is to kind of figure those things out.
Awesome. So I'm going to close with a question, and for those of you in the room who are also on the Jane's Walk board, you know that I trade in warm and fuzzy. So bear with me as I force you to wear your heart on your sleeve as we close the talk. You know, one of the things I was really inspired by this year was Jane Jacobs would have been 100, and so we're celebrating her centenary. And we had the special event a few months ago where Paul Bedford got up and, with a whole bunch of, he had a whole bunch of unscripted, beautiful things to say. And one of the things he said, and he said it much more eloquently than this, I'm butchering it for sure, but he said, the one thing that Jane always said was just do the easy thing first. I've thought about that, and I brought it into my everyday for the last 2 months. I found it really inspiring. And so as I look at this room, it's such a diverse group of, very sophisticated, long-standing city builders, and like I see a whole bunch of studio wires and, a new cohort of people emerging into this space, wanting to make a life out of wanting to make a profession out of, making the city better as a professional practice. We just heard from, a new person entering this marketplace. And so the question I have for you to sort of close our night is, what do we do tomorrow? You have these 4 amazing areas for the future. And I think we all want to feel enabled in some way to be actionable about it. And so whether it's in the way that we interface with Artscape or in what we go and do in our day-to-day practice, is there something we can do to advance the mandate that we need to create creative places that are integrated, where artists and the public are integrated? What can we do tomorrow and in the subsequent days ahead?
Good question. I think so much of this work is about sort of building connections with other people.
Yeah.
And I think that, it starts really with not thinking about, as I said earlier, what your need is, but, what value can you bring in whatever situation it is? How can you actually enter the conversation from that perspective?
Right.
And, that's where I think innovative, interesting things are going to happen for people. If they get, stop thinking about how they're going to solve their personal problem, but how they can actually come to the table with some value, then that really kind of opens up the conversation. We were mentoring a group in Edmonton, and they took this approach, and because they'd had a really terrible relationship with the economic development people there, and we mentored them, and we said, why don't you go into the meeting and say, what can we do for you? What policies can we help you advance? Well, the people they met with almost fell off the chair, right? Because it was just such a different approach than the pattern that they've been in, and it kind of unblocked and opened things up so that they could have a different conversation. So that's my best advice, is to figure out, not what you need, but what value can you bring to the table.
Right. Well, that's a nice circle back to our acupuncture theme. Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Thank you for bearing with all these questions and letting us really have a window into what it's like to do this kind of work. Because, I think you sort of pulled back the curtain on some of the complexities that I think all of us need to hear a little bit more about. So it just feels like a great gift to get to sit and have a conversation with you. So thank you, and I think on behalf of all of us, thanks so much for tonight.
Thanks, Sarah.